Achievements of the human species. On our program today, one small step. We begin with this look back from CNN's David George.
As you get close to it, it's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine.
Do you remember the words?
I'm going to step off the limb.
The words burned in history.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Remember the man whose words launched that mighty leap?
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
12, 11, 10, 9, ignition sequence start, 6.
Seems so simple now. He said do it, and we did.
2, 1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff, we have a liftoff.
Went to the moon.
Capcom, we're go for landing.
Altitude 4,200.
Houston, you're a go for landing, over. Roger, understand, go for landing, 3,000 feet.
You're looking great.
And they made it look easy. Armstrong, Aldrin, Collins, modern Magellans, with a cast of thousands.
Eagle looking great.
Magellan might have wondered if he'd sail round the world or right off its edge. So did they.
Flying to the moon is a long and delicate daisy chain of events. Any link in the chain, if it gets severed, ruins the whole thing.
We knew, and we didn't know what to expect. They'd landed, but could they leave? They did. Could they find the mothership? They did. Would it find its way home to Earth? It did.
Apollo 11, Houston, through Orion, standing by, over.
Would all the things that had to work?
Stroke.
They did. Would Columbia find its target? Be found by its recovery ship? It was, and it was done.
Apollo 11, this is Hornet, over.
It was done.
Apollo 11, reach the last course. Our position 1330, 6915.
It's been 30 years, 3 decades, a whole generation now since that wonderful, fantastic summer of '69, when we slipped the surly bonds of Earth.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Reached out our hands.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground.
And touched the moon.
You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue.
David George, CNN.
We have to take a break, but when we come back, the souvenirs and the science the spacemen brought back. Stay with us. It looks like fun, skipping across the lunar surface, etching a place in history. But the Apollo missions were much more than expensive joyrides. They were voyages of discovery. Welcome back. Even after 1969, sending explorers into space seemed to be more closely linked to science fiction than reality. But the futuristic journeys helped to unlock secrets of the past. Here's CNN's John Zarella.
Before the Apollo missions, what scientists knew about the moon would barely have filled a scrapbook.
What we knew about the moon before that, you could forget. The Apollo just, filled books after books after books of information.
The rock samples returned to Earth by the astronauts have answered with near certainty a question asked by just about anyone who has gazed up at the moon on a clear night. Where did it come from?
We now think that the origin of the moon occurred when the early Earth and some object that no longer exists collided about 4.5 billion years ago and sprayed debris into Earth orbit, and that material later coagulated into the moon.
Studies showed that some moon rocks were so similar to Earth rocks they had to come from the same place.
The moon is an accident. It's, if you will, it's been bred by an impact from two separate bodies.
The moon is to science a Rosetta Stone. The rocks have given geologists an understanding of how collisions with asteroids and comets can rearrange a planet. Dating moon rocks, which are far older than any found on Earth, has led to an understanding of the time scale for the solar system's evolution. Apollo showed the moon could provide resources: aluminum, titanium, and iron. Someday when humans turn on a light, the power source could come from the moon. Thanks to Apollo, scientists now know the moon contains large amounts of an isotope, helium-3, the best fuel for nuclear fusion, which would generate cheap, pollution-free power. 1 ton of helium-3 would provide the energy for the whole United States for a year. 30 years after the first moon rocks were brought to Earth, only 75 of the 850 pounds have been analyzed. Money for further studies has been tough to come by. But perhaps Apollo's most lasting impact on humans came not from a rock, but from a view of the Earth.
The Earth from here is a grand oasis of the big vastness of space.
John Zarella, CNN, at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
There's a phrase enshrined in the lore of the American space program, immortalized in magazines, books, and at least one movie. The astronauts who journeyed into space seemed to be a breed apart, made, as the phrase had it, of the right stuff. NASA today no doubt believes that its astronauts, its scientists, its staff are as good as ever. But increasingly, even NASA finds that when it looks around at the right stuff, it sees stuff that's looking old. CNN's Miles O'Brien has a look.
Oh man, look at that. This is a pretty great spring break. You can't beat this.
Where's the gyroscope? Oh my God, that's so cool. Ah.
Coming out, feet down.
Oh.
Yeah, coming out.
KC-135.
They'll form a very strong crystal structure. It's a very firm, solid material. Whoa, we're rocking on the ceiling, Chris. This is incredible.
NASA isn't flying these expensive thrill rides just to entertain some bright college students. And quite frankly, no one expects any real scientific breakthroughs here. The real reason for this stomach-churning science fair is recruiting.
A technical problem, the wrong stuff. We'll be back with more right after this. The 3 Apollo 11 astronauts were honored on the 30th anniversary of their flight with one of the most prestigious awards in aviation. They were each given the Langley Gold Medal at a ceremony at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington. The Langley has been awarded 21 times before. The first recipients were the Wright brothers in 1909. Welcome back. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins are American heroes. Their achievement and that of everyone involved with the Apollo program is a remarkable one. But what does it really amount to? John Pike of the Federation of American Scientists joins us now to talk about that. Thanks so much for being with us. Are you one of the people who gets all misty-eyed on a day like today?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that everyone who can remember the Apollo moon landing remembers exactly where they were. I was in the basement of my parents' house, who they were with, my parents, some of my high school chums, and I can remember very clearly jumping up and down, and because it was one of the tremendous accomplishments of human history, and certainly when you look at all of the terrible things that have happened in the 20th century, I'm hopeful that this is one of the good things that our era will be remembered for in the future. It's a great achievement.
It's an achievement that we can look back on maybe a little more clearly than we looked at it then. When you look back at it, what got those men to the moon? Was it technology? Was it science? Was it the arms race? Or was it a time of enormous national pride and purpose?
Well, it was all of those things, but I think the fundamental question you have to ask is, why is it that the United States made it to the moon and the Soviet Union didn't? Because they won many of the early rounds of the space race, and we won the most important one. And I think it's basically because of what we were trying to demonstrate, namely the superiority of the American system. It was all of those things. It was the technology, the management of the technology, the support of the American people, and the way that we organize our society, demonstrating that if we want to do something, regardless of how challenging, we can do it.
So it was essentially a trophy, you're making it sound like.
Well, I think that you have to return to where we were back in the 1960s. There were real questions about what's the best way to organize society, real questions about what is the future of life here on Earth. It was a contest to demonstrate that. And I think that it was basically an expression of American core national identity, pioneering frontiers, individual heroes using high technology. That's the reason that the Air and Space Museum continues to be so popular, because the Air and Space Museum, Apollo, all of these things really remind us about what it is to be an American and, in a larger sense, what it is to be a human being. It's a tremendous accomplishment, not simply for America, but for everyone.
What did they say to you about science? Was this, in any sense, a scientific mission?
Well, it was certainly a scientific mission because, as you previously noted on the show, we really didn't know anything about the moon before the Apollo missions took place, apart from roughly where it was in the sky. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that we were not doing it primarily for the science, even though that was interesting. We were primarily doing it to win the space race, and I think because it really resonated with the American people that this was a very American thing to do.
If getting to the moon was not a question of national pride or of military achievement, but simply a scientific expedition, how different would the expedition have been?
Oh, well, we wouldn't have done it. If you look at the amount of money that we spent on Apollo, let's adjust this all for inflation and put it in 1999 dollars, the ones you have in your wallet right now. We spent about $150 billion on Apollo. That's 6 times what we spent on the Manhattan Project that built the first atomic bomb, and that's probably equivalent to all of the money that the federal government spent on basic research at the National Science Foundation in the last half century. When you stack up the cost of Apollo against what we've spent on other big engineering projects and what we spent on scientific research, if it was for science alone, going to the moon with people would still be science fiction. There's no way we would have done it just for the science.
NASA now has funding that is about, I'm told, about half of what it was then.
Actually, about a third when you adjust for inflation. It was about $35 billion a year, nearly $40 billion at the Apollo peak, and now it's down to about 13, so it's way down.
Is the amount of money now more appropriate to the actual science, to the actual achievement that NASA is involved in?
Well, I think it's appropriate both to the scientific robotic missions that we're flying, some of which have been tremendously exciting, almost as exciting as some of those early ones back in the 1960s. It's also appropriate to the piloted mission, which continues to have largely a foreign policy and national security objective. During the 1960s, we needed to spend an awful lot of money to beat the Soviets to the moon. In the 1990s, we're spending significantly less, but nonetheless some serious money to cooperate with the Russians to build an international space station. Now, hopefully at some point in the next century, we're going to take longer strides, take bolder steps, join with other nations, go back to the moon, and eventually send humans to Mars. But for what we're doing right now, the budget's a little bit less than I'd like to see, but there's simply no big project readily at hand with political support like Apollo.
Let me ask you about the Pathfinder mission and the missions of Discovery to Mars that aren't sending people there for now. Are those scientific missions primarily? When we take people out of the equation, do we see space science being done?
Absolutely. I think that that's one of the basic divisions that you have to make in the space program, particularly right now. The scientific program sends robots. The program that's fundamentally a political and cultural exercise sends people. And as long as you understand that that's the appropriate division of labor, the the way our program's currently structured, I think that you'll wind up with a program that satisfies the various things that you can do from space. But to try to think that the piloted program should satisfy scientific objectives and pay for itself that way, I think is misdirecting what human spaceflight's about. It's basically about adventure.
Is the adventure more dangerous than it was when we see shuttles take off now with people aboard? Is it a less dangerous enterprise than it was when Neil Armstrong and his crew took off?
I really don't think there's any way of quantifying that. Spaceflight has always been about the most dangerous form of transportation ever invented. Any way you slice it, it's tens, if not hundreds of thousands of times more dangerous than flying on a passenger airplane. The Apollo astronauts were flying on a slightly less proven, reliable rocket. They had an escape tower that would make it a little easier for them to get away in case something went wrong. Space Shuttle has flown a lot more than the Saturn V ever would. Despite the Challenger accident, it's probably the safest rocket flying right now, but if or when something does go wrong, unfortunately, it'd be very difficult for the crew to get out.
So why does it make sense to send people to Mars? If machines are already going there successfully, you mentioned just in passing that you think it's a good idea. Why is it a good idea?
I think it would be eventually, hopefully in my lifetime, a good idea for the same reason that Apollo was a good idea 30 years ago and the space station is a good idea today. It makes sense as a foreign policy objective to demonstrate American leadership and the way that we're able to work with other nations in space to solve problems eventually here on Earth. It would also simply be an adventure. It would be a memorable historical achievement that I think that anyone in a generation that has the opportunity to contribute to that achievement, even if by just sending in a few tax dollars and cheering it on television, that anyone would welcome the opportunity to participate in something that will remain a shining moment in the history books for centuries and millennia to come. We've certainly done that with Apollo. We did it with the Wright brothers, Christopher Columbus. Hopefully, we'll be able to do it with Mars as well.
Do you think that's going to happen?
30 years ago, when I was watching the Apollo program, I was watching it through the eyes of somebody who had watched Stanley Kubrick's movie 2001, which we all thought was pretty much a blueprint for what was going to happen. Well, here we are 3 decades later, and you can't get to the space station on a Pan Am shuttle because there isn't even a Pan Am anymore. I'm hopeful, though, in the next couple of decades, we're going to get a little closer to Mars than we have in the last couple of decades, and maybe I'll live long enough.
On that note, we thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Finally, there were many stories from the moon mission, but one tale never had to be told. Here's CNN's Garrick Utley with it.
We're now in the approach phase, everything looking good.
What if it had all gone terribly, terribly wrong? If Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had been marooned on the Sea of Tranquility, if their lunar module had failed to lift off? A possibility all the Apollo astronauts had to face on the moon.
Well, I never planned not to come back, yet we knew we were vulnerable to a whole host of problems that we maybe didn't have any control over, and that could have been one of them.
That the astronauts might be stranded on the moon in their lunar module, like the one here at the National Air and Space Museum, and die there was a fate neither NASA nor the White House wanted to talk about publicly. But behind the scenes, plans were drawn up and a presidential speech prepared, just in case. William Safire, now a New York Times columnist, was a speechwriter for Richard Nixon. Shortly before the moon landing, he recalls being asked a question by astronaut Frank Borman.
And I can hear him say it now, like what to do for the widows. And at that moment, it struck me that, what if there were a disaster?
If Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had been stranded, lost in space, the president would have called the astronauts' wives. They, presumably, would have had the opportunity to speak with their husbands one last time. Then, Richard Nixon would have taken the speech with the heading, "An Event of Moon Disaster," and addressed a shocked and saddened nation. It begins, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace." Following the address, a clergyman would commend the souls of the two men, as in a burial at sea, to the deepest of the deep. And at Mission Control, radio communication would be shut down. And what would happen then?
A lot of people say, what would you have done had you not been able to get off the surface of the moon? I don't have the vaguest idea what I would have done. We had about a day's worth of oxygen and electrical power, and That would have been about it.
In their lunar module, the Eagle, Armstrong and Aldrin would face a choice: die slowly or quickly by taking their own lives. Of course, it didn't end that way. The lunar module lifted off successfully, carrying the astronauts back to the orbiting command ship and to a triumphal return to Earth. As for that speech Richard Nixon never gave, this is how William Safire concluded it.
For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind.
The tragedy that might have been, but never was. Garrett Utley, CNN, Washington.
And that's Insight for this day. I'm Jonathan Mann. There's more news just ahead.